Okay, so this is our tactical trigger Glock enhanced trigger kit. So we're going to show a quick install. These are really just drop-in parts. There's our enhanced minus connector with this trigger bar alignment tab, which is kind of where what makes this kit a little bit different, and it's going to give you more of the benefits that you're looking for if you want a clean wall and break. There's over travel stops. You select one of those two to minimize the over travel for your gun. And then there's the reduced powered firing pin safety spring to smooth out your pre-travel, and an increased power trigger spring for lighter pre-travel. And you can use these springs in combination for pull weight reduction as well. So if you're not interested in lower pull weight, you might only run the reduced powered firing pin safety spring for just the benefits on pre-travel smoothness, and then you can run the stock trigger spring instead. So here I have a stock a Glock 19 Gen 4, and I do have a Gen 3 trigger bar in here rather than a Gen 4, so that makes this trigger slightly better than a normal stock, but for all intents and purposes it really is just a stock trigger. So let's look at what that looks like. So we got, it's not horrible, but we do have some kind of weird, kind of bumping in the pre-travel. Then we get to the wall, and one thing that I'm going to mention is I have a dummy round in the chamber, and I have dummy rounds in the magazine, because that will keep the slide from buckling, which will show the best possible performance of a Glock trigger. So we got kind of that bumping action in the pre-travel. We get to kind of the wall, and then we have kind of this squish to find the real wall, and then it's going to break clean. And then on the reset, we have a reset back, and then we have that same squish back into the wall. So let's see that one more time. So there's kind of that squish back. So you guys should be kind of familiar with what the Glock trigger feels like, and you'll know why you're looking for something a little bit better. So I'm going to get right into the install now. So I'm going to start with preparing the upper. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to install that reduced powered firing pin safety spring. So I come here and I push down on that striker sleeve with, you'll need a Glock Armorer's tool, and then I'm going to install the Glock Armorer's black plate. We have those available as well. So I'm going to pull out the striker assembly, and then I'm going to pull the extractor and then drop the firing pin safety. Okay, so I'm going to remove the stock spring. I'll set that aside. I'm going to take this reduced powered one that I have. I'm going to push it down in there to get it seated into the end of the notch on there. Okay, and I'm going to start by putting this in first. And then I'm going to put my ejector back, or my extractor, sorry. Put that back in there, okay, and then I'm going to make sure that that's got the correct spring tension. Put my striker back in, put my extractor spring, and then rather than the stock back plate, I'm going to install this Armorer's back plate so I can view the trigger bar to firing pin engagement as I'm doing this install. Okay, so I've got everything installed in there correctly. The firing pin is being blocked until I press the safety. Okay, so that's ready to go, so I won't need to do anything more with that other than replace the back plate when I'm done. Okay, then I come into the lower, and I'm going to knock out this top pin first. That's going to help me relieve tension on the slide stop spring. And on a Gen 5 it doesn't have that, so you just go to this. Okay, then I'm going to knock out this trigger pin, which I need to kind of wiggle the slide stop as I do this, so I just like to lay that down flat. Wiggle that until it pops through, okay, and then I'm through the retention portion of that, and then I can pull that pin. And then I just have my last trigger pin here, or trigger housing pin to knock out. Now I've got that out, I can pry up on the locking block, pull the locking block out, set that aside. Oh, I can set the slide catch aside as well. Then I can pull out the lower trigger group. Okay, and I'll set my frame aside. I'm into the lower trigger group. So now I'm just gonna disassemble this. But one thing to note is look at how your stock spring is assembled, the direction, the orientation, and that it's seated correctly in the notch of the trigger bar there. Okay, so I'm gonna pull this out. One other thing that I'm gonna look at is how my connector's seated, kind of the level of, you know, connector tension, how much outward movement and how much tension that stock connector has. So I'm going to replace the connector now with our enhanced minus connector. Okay, so we've already got all this pre-adjusted for tension and whatnot, so the tension looks very similar to what was on the stock, and they might be a little bit different, and you probably want to go with the initial tension that we've set from the factory. This trigger bar alignment tab has also been set, and we'll check that when we go to install. So the next order of business is I'm going to take either my reduced powered spring or my stock spring, depending on what I'm looking for. I would probably recommend you start with the increased powered spring. So I'm going to put that in the hook orientation, coming in this way, rolling down, and then this side is coming across down. I'm going to put that in the notch of the trigger bar and make sure that I rotate that so it's going to seat in the notch of the trigger bar. So then I'm going to pull forward a little bit with tension so that I get it to stay seated in that notch. And then I'm going to verify that it stayed seated in the notch of the trigger bar as I got that in. Okay, so now that's basically installed and ready to put back in. So I put that back into the frame. I'm going to put the trigger pin in. Okay, and then I am going to go ahead and put my locking block back in. And then I'm going to start with the first top pin on a Gen 4. On a Gen 5, you just put your slide stop back in. We'll show a Gen 5, excuse me, we'll show a Gen 5 installation another time. So I seat that first pin back in there, and I'm going to start my second pin from the side, and I'm not going to seat it all the way, and I'm going to do that so that I can get my slide stop in. And I don't want to cause a failure with my side stop spring. It needs to be underneath this first pin, so I like to do it in this order. Okay, push that in, and my spring is seated right. And then I get the trigger pin back seated, and then I'll pull that up a few times just to make sure that that locked in place. And it's locked in place. Okay, so that's my lower, and that's how easy that was on the install. So now I'm going to check first if my trigger bar alignment tab is working correctly. I'm going to pull my trigger forward resting on the safety, and if it was able to come up on the drop cell shelf, then I know that this was adjusted at least in one aspect well. Okay, so if it would have gotten stuck right there, that means that I had the trigger bar alignment tab was off, and I would have made a quick adjustment with that. And I'll show adjustments later, but everything can be adjusted with your armorer's tool. Normally you don't need to do that, but that's the first thing you check for, is to make sure that it does that. The other thing I'm going to check for is that it's holding the trigger bar down against the housing, so there's not much play in there. So as I look at this vertically, the trigger bar alignment, it's not popping up, and I'm not able to kind of get it to pop up. So what this trigger bar alignment tab is doing is it's keeping the trigger bar vertical and not able to cant up to the side like that. And we'll look at that when we look at the Seer Engagement. So that's looking good. Okay, and so basically I've got everything installed except for an over travel stop. And I'm gonna I'll install the over travel stop after I look at what's going on with Seer Engagement. So I'm going to install my slide with the armorer's plate on. And if you can see in here, I'm not sure how well this is showing up on the camera. You can look at the Seer Engagement as I pull the trigger. So the trigger bar is maintaining alignment with the horizontal alignment with the firing pin as I pull the trigger. And I'm just verifying here. I'm going to put that snap cap back in. So I'm just verifying here the alignment and the level of sear engagement. So as I'm looking at this, I can see that I've got more than the 2/3 sear engagement, and I can press down on the frame and I can pull it up and I can see that it's about fully engaged when it's compressed, when the slide's compressed into the frame, and it's about 80% engaged when I'm pulling up. And so that's what I want. Then I'm going to also check my engagement and reset. So I'm holding the trigger pinned to the rear, and then I'm looking at the engagement and reset, and it's the exact same, about 100% and then about 80%. Okay, so now I verified those aspects, and what I'm going to check for here too at the same time to make sure that my trigger bar alignment tab is good is I'm going to check for a clean break. And it looks like I've got a nice hard wall, so I know that that's set up well. So I can go ahead and I can proceed. And at this point, I just do all my safety checks. So I've already done my sear engagement check. I've already seen that my trigger bar goes up on the drop safety shelf when I pull that forward. I can check my trigger safety by not pressing on it, making sure that that's not slipping off, which would result in fire. So I know that that's good. And I know that my trigger spring is installed correctly, and I can see that my trigger safety with the slide rack all came back into proper engagement, so the trigger safety is completely functional. And that all looks like it's functioning well. And so the only thing left to do is, if I want, I can minimize my over travel. So on this gun, all I have to do to install the over travel stop, just pull the trigger safety forward, take one of my over travel stops. I'm going to do the over travel stop 1, which gives me the maximum amount of over travel reduction. And this kind of depends on the level of sear engagement and the part tolerances of your trigger bar, connector, and your slide to frame tolerance, your firing pin, all those things on which one you can get away with. But anyway, so I just drop this, and it uninstalls by just flipping that over, and it's retained when the slide is installed, and the spring tension whenever you pull the trigger always pins the Glock trigger to the rear. So there's no concerns about this, coming out or anything like that. So I take this layered end and I put it in between the gap between the trigger bar in there, and then this tab goes forward to the side, and so I put that in here, right like that, drop that down, okay, and that's installed. Okay, so now I'm just going to check the performance of that with the over travel stop installed. So I'm gonna push down on the rear of the slide, and I don't have my mag with dummy rounds inserted. I'm gonna press down on the rear of the slide and check and see. I can get a little bit more of a rolling break like that because there's going to be more engagement and so forth. But the thing that I was checking for was a clean break at the end. And so this one breaks clean with the number 1, so I wouldn't need to go to a number 2. If it didn't break clean, I would use a number 2 over travel stop. And if that didn't break clean, then I would look at, maybe I've got an over engaged condition, maybe I want to switch out some parts or do some other adjustments for that. We'll come back with a more detailed video on how to do more advanced adjustments and so forth, but really most of these parts in most of the guns out there will just be a drop in, and you'll be able to get this kind of performance. So let's look now. So we've checked this sear engagement, we've checked that. The other reliability checks that we can do are, let's make sure that we're getting a firing pin rattle after fire. So I know that there's not striker safety interference going on, so nothing to steal any firing energy or light primer strikes. And we're using a stock firing pin spring, so no concerns there. Okay, so if I want to finish the install, I can just install my uninstall the armor's plate and install the correct back plate. Okay, And so that's done. Now let's look at the overall performance. So I'm going to do that again with, I'm going to install a snap cap, and I just like to do this just to protect the gun in the long run. And then also I've got a mag with dummy rounds to eliminate this buckling of the slide to frame when you're pulling the trigger, which I'll show you why. So I can get a little bit more of a rolling break if I really pull the trigger slow because of that. If I use a mag with dummy rounds in it, then I'm gonna have the best performance. So I get a really nice wall and then a clean break, very short reset back on. Okay, and so I can also do that by checking the correct performance by pulling up on the rear of the slide. That would mimic the same thing as a mag with dummy rounds in it. Okay, so that's the install, and so some of the adjustments that can be done we describe in the kit as really these are drop-in parts. They're still configurations and adjustability. So if I want to adjust pull weight, I can do different combinations of the stock firing pin safety spring and the ones provided in the kit, or the increased powered trigger spring, or the stock spring. And I primarily recommend starting, if you want to get your pull weight higher, with using the stock trigger spring. The over travel adjustment we talked about. If you're not getting a clean wall, if you're still getting some of that Glock stacking, then we can make an adjustment to the alignment tab on the connector. And so the best way to do that is the alignment tab can be bent up and down slightly, and you can do that with your alignment tool. So the way that we set these in the factory is we'll actually use some special tools and whatnot, but you can actually use your armor tool for any fine adjustment that needs to be made. So if we're getting some extra play, upward movement, I can pull that forward, and then I could actually just do something like this to insert the tool and then just press down to make sure that that's bent down enough to get that alignment correct. And then if I happen to have a condition where with the tolerance of my gun I'm not getting it back up on the shelf, I would just take my tool in the back here and pry up slightly enough until it can get up on the drop shelf. And I don't want to do too much, but there's these are still pretty stout, so there's a little bit of pressure that needs to be applied for doing something like that. But basically that's the kind of adjustment that needs to be made for the trigger bar alignment tab, and that's very rare that you would need to do that. These come from the factory ready to go, and should deal with all the tolerance variations out there well. The other thing that you can have going on is you could have a under engagement or over engagement condition between your trigger bar and your firing pin, and so that's what you're checking for with your armorer's plate installed. And with that, you could change the combination of parts that you use, and you can also adjust the trigger bar directly to accommodate unique tolerances. And so, we kind of recommend for optimum performance with this concept, probably about an 80% sear engagement level is kind of the target. And most guns, stock trigger bars, stock guns, that's, you should have about that level without needing to do anything. And if you want to increase the sear engagement, then the trigger bar could be adjusted. The cruciform kick up here could be adjusted upward to do that, or downward if it's an overgauge condition. But that's a pretty advanced concept, and we might show how that might work later. But for the most part, these should be drop-in kits. So that's pretty much the install video and overview. So let's show that performance one more time here. So really smooth, light pre-travel to a nice wall. Very short, clean break, short, fast reset, right back on the wall. So this trigger's symmetric, in line with the way that most defensive shooters are trained. The other thing is the pull weight's been reduced to about 3.5 pounds as opposed to the over 5 pounds in the stock configuration, and then you can adjust that pull weight up as well. So that's the basic install.